Hi everyone, welcome to part 3 of our World War II lecture summaries. Today we're going to talk about what was the economic impact of U.S. involvement in World War II and how did World War II affect American women and minorities. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the home front. I think John Green's videos really address this situation. But the thing I want you to get out of this is, first of all, the intense industrial mobilization. I mean, when Japanese commanders said that they had awakened a sleeping giant, part of that is the American capacity for manufacturing. We have huge numbers of factories. And we have huge numbers of workers to employ those factories. So it was like no one could compete with America's ability to produce stuff. In fact, by the time the United States industries get rolling, we are producing more than Germany and Japan combined. Now, one of the things that we have to do during World War II is we have to deal with limitations on supplies. So we want to make sure that our service personnel fighting overseas have food and clothing and supplies, and we want to make sure that we're able to supply those same things to our allies. So we do have to work within rationing system. So the American government would mail each family a ration coupon booklet each month. And in order to buy the ration supplies, you needed both money and a coupon. Once you've used up, say, your gasoline coupons, you couldn't buy any more gasoline that month. Or if you used up all of your coffee or sugar ration coupons, you had to wait until the next month to be able to buy more. So this has an impact on the American population. But what I really want to spend some time on is, how does World War II affect different groups within the United States? So beginning here with African Americans in World War II, the first thing that we see is another great migration. We see thousands of Southern, mostly rural African Americans moving out of those southern states and into the industrial cities of the North. But we also see a heavy movement out west. And the reason is places in California, Oregon, and Washington state become key shipbuilding centers of the World War II era. Now, within this population, we see a social movement, the Double V campaign. I want you to put a little star next to this because the Double V campaign is going to contribute to the post-World War II civil rights movement. But what it stands for is victory in the war against fascism and victory at home against segregation. So for many African Americans, especially those serving in the military, there seems to be this hypocrisy within American society and within the American government that we're fighting against Hitler's racism and discrimination, and yet accepting the discrimination and segregation of African Americans at home. So the Double V campaign is a fight against both of those. Despite the racism and segregation within American society and the American military, we do see individuals and groups who distinguish themselves despite this. So in the upper right-hand corner, we see a photo of the Tuskegee Airmen. These are fighter pilots and bomber pilots who were trained in Tuskegee, Alabama, to contribute to the war effort in Europe. The man at the lower right-hand corner is Dory Miller. He was from Waco, Texas, and Dory Miller served in the Navy. But because of the segregation of the U.S. military, the only jobs that African Americans could have in the Navy were as cooks or servants. And if you've seen the movie Pearl Harbor, I realize it's a little old at this point, but Dory Miller was actually portrayed by the actor Cuba Gooding Jr. And the reason he is remarkable is because when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Dory Miller took control of a .50 caliber machine gun and shot down at least 4 Japanese airplanes. And that's remarkable because he was never trained to use that weapon. Now, sadly, Dory Miller survived the Pearl Harbor attack, but doesn't live throughout the war. In 1943, he is killed when his ship is attacked in the Pacific. For American women, we also see a huge movement into the factories. First of all, what a lot of people don't recognize is that nearly 200,000 American women joined the armed forces, and they served mostly in auxiliary roles. They served as secretaries, as receptionists, as nurses, but some also served as flight trainers, so they taught people how to be fighter pilots. But the bigger story is the roughly 6 million American women who entered the civilian workforce. Most people have seen the Rosie the Riveter propaganda poster there in the upper left. And this was the American government's effort to get American women to support the war economically by taking those factory jobs. I mentioned it before that World War I didn't really have the sizable impact on American women that World War II would. Because in World War I, many of the women who went into the war workforce were young single women who were already there. They just transitioned into better paying war jobs. But in World War II, the big story is that we had huge numbers of older married women entering the workforce, some of them for the very first time. So if we think about this national story of American women leaving the kitchen and entering the factory to do their patriotic duty, that's definitely a story of World War II and not of World War I. Another 2 groups that I want to mention are Mexican and Mexican Americans and Native Americans. First, with Mexican and Mexican Americans, approximately 500,000 Hispanic men served in the military during the war, but many still faced discrimination. We're not really going to talk about the story of Felix Longoria, who was in the military from Texas, but if you see the topic resource folder, there's a documentary there about what happens to him and his family after he is killed in the line of duty. We see a huge impact in the Southwest because of the Bracero program. Because wartime had drawn many men out of the workforce and into the military, there was a shortage of labor, particularly farm labor in the Southwest. So the United States and Mexico came to an agreement called the Bracero Program, where Mexican farm workers could come into the U.S. on a seasonal basis to help with the farming. So whether it was planting or harvest, these workers would come into the United States for a specified period of time. And then once they went back to Mexico, they were allowed to purchase certain bits of farm equipment on credit. Interesting side note about this is that initially Texas wasn't allowed to participate in the Bracero program because of its reputation for treating Mexicans and Mexican Americans very badly. The Mexican government wouldn't allow the state of Texas to participate. Now, by the end of the war, Texas would get its stuff together and be able to participate, but at least initially it wasn't allowed. A second group here, Native Americans, they have a kind of an interesting story in World War II as well. Roughly 1/3 of eligible Native American men served in the armed forces. That's a huge percentage of the male population. All branches of service represented, but within that population, Native Americans had an opportunity that other Americans did not. The U.S. Army is going to recruit certain Native American populations to take advantage of their unique languages. So you may have heard about the Navajo Code Talkers, and this is a group of young men who spoke the Navajo language and then transitioned that language into a code. The reason this was possible is because there were roughly 5,000 Navajo speakers in the world, and every single one of those people was a Navajo Indian. So in other words, no non-Navajos spoke the Navajo language. So these young men were trained as radio operators. They were the ones who were going to relay information from headquarters to the field and back. And they're going to do it in a language that's nearly extinct. Now, the problem is that the Navajo language doesn't have words for bombs or tanks or battleships. So they had to get creative. When they were talking about the different sized ships, the code talkers would use different sized fish to describe what type of vessel they were talking about. And then when it came to airplanes, they would talk about different sized birds. And so this was their way of talking about the military movement, the equipment, all sorts of things. Now, one of the frustrating things is that the United States is going to come out of the Great Depression as a result of World War II. I mean, all of the money that President Roosevelt pumps into the economy through the New Deal doesn't really solve the Great Depression. It's once the entire economy mobilizes to fight World War II that we actually escape the Great Depression. But unfortunately, that wartime prosperity does not extend to Native American reservations. In fact, these areas continue to be some of the most impoverished places in America. Our final group that I want to talk about here are Japanese and Japanese Americans, because they are going to face a unique discrimination during World War II. Because the Japanese military attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, many people became afraid that Japanese Americans were going to sabotage the American war effort, or that people were going to assist a Japanese invasion of the United States. So President Franklin Roosevelt is going to issue Executive Order 9066, which requires Japanese and Japanese Americans to report to relocation camps. These are basically prison camps. The concern is that the largest Japanese and Japanese American population is along the west coast of the United States, and that the thought is that any invasion from Japan would come from the west. So the idea here is to remove Japanese and Japanese Americans from the west coast into a more secure interior location. Now, what's frustrating about this is that more than 60% of these individuals are U.S. citizens. So yes, the United States government is rounding up U.S. citizens and placing them in prison camps. And these people are forced to get rid of their property, of their possessions. Many people relocated to these camps with just the clothes that they had. Despite the discrimination, many Japanese American men served with distinction. The 442nd Nisei Regimental Combat Team was one of the most highly decorated military units in American history. So despite this discrimination, despite this segregation, these men fought with distinction. So coming back to our questions to think about, what was the economic impact of U.S. involvement in World War II? And the answer is, it ends the Great Depression. And then second, how did World War II affect American women and minority groups? As we've just seen, each of these groups is going to be affected by the war in a different way. For many people, it meant moving into better paying jobs. For others, it meant facing really severe discrimination and segregation. So stay tuned for part 4 of World War II.